Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ninth episode of Hybrid Chats, where John Reardon and myself meet in a two-cold riverside, usually different parts of the country or different parts of the world. And we chat about all things hybrid, remote, office, and everything in between. Today, I am dialing in from sunny Madeira. I have officially escaped the weather of Northern Europe. Storm Debbie was the most recent thing. Where are you, John? How are the storms where you are?
I'm in Cork, so I'm very jealous of the sunshine that you have in Madeira. However, we've got better Wi-Fi than you have in Madeira. So
Yeah,
in the current kind of the munitions war or the arms race in our world is based upon the strength of broadband, and I would give it to Cork today. Cork versus Madeira, but that will
I
change
think
over time.
I think Cork wins for sure. I think Cork wins for sure. There's a lot of things happening in Madeira, in all fairness. It's a bit of a remote workers haven. And there is great stuff that's happened here. Maybe not so much where I am. But yeah, for now you win Wi-Fi, I win sunshine. Priorities, right? And today we have a couple of really interesting reports to start with that have just come out. The first one is by a company called Flex Index and their Flex report. They teamed with Boston Consulting Group for this one. And surprise, surprise, what they were really after in figuring out in this report is this ongoing thing that certainly, John, you and I have talked so much about with all the articles and reports that have come out. Is hybrid and remote better or worse for productivity? And we know it's an ongoing thing. We know there's no shortage of opinions. So they went the data approach and they decided to look at the financial performance of publicly traded companies, where obviously the financial performance is publicly available information. And what they found is that when they looked at industry by industry, so we're not talking tech compared to banking, but tech company compared to tech company, banking company compared to banking company, they saw that the companies that had some form of hybrid and remote were actually 16% better performing than their counterparts. What are your thoughts on this, John?
Well, I think it's a great monthly report overall on the state of the marketplace. And the first thing I would do is encourage any of the folks who are listening to this to subscribe to the report. It comes out on a monthly basis. So it's one of those kind of, let's call it the pillar reports that come out. So the Flex Index is the one. So the key points that this one drove was the use of data rather than subjective opinion. And how they did it was they analyzed 554 US public companies. So in essence, it's a large survey, and it's definitely not the type of survey that draws these BS clickbait sound bites and headlines that we constantly find on the web. This is a large data cohort. So large, in fact, that these companies employ a collective 26.7 million people. So this would go down into that category of a big ass survey. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
And the
agreed.
survey found that fully flexible, the survey found that fully flexible firms, which are either completely remote or allow employees to choose when they come to an office. So let's call it fully flexible. They increased sales 21% between 2020 and 2022 on an industry adjusted basis. So increased sales. So that's just one metric, increased sales. Now, that compares to, in the same time period, the opposite group of companies. These are companies that are either hybrid or fully on site. They had a 5% growth. So the delta between 21 and 5 is what you talked about earlier on, that 16% increase. So it is correct to say that in that period of time, companies that were hybrid or fully on site grew 5%. However, the other cohort of companies that are fully flexible had a 4x growth during that time scale. So it's a very interesting little nuance. and you got to be very careful about when you click into headlines and how you take headlines, because as I said, the hybrid companies and the fixed location companies did actually grow, but nowhere near the pace of others.
Yeah, no, makes
That to me
sense completely.
is the most basic finding: is don't listen to, or don't get attracted by clickbait headlines and CEO exhortations that you must come back to the office. It's
Yeah,
just not worth
no,
it.
that's great. And I'm going to act as a bit of a bad cop here, though, for a second, because obviously, one thing that you and I have talked a lot about is the fact that you also have to look at the source. Who is providing the data? And is there anything that they may have to gain, right? So in this case, the Flex Index does have something to gain from the numbers looking this way. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Correct.
Um, and when you think about, what contributes to a company's growth, there certainly is a multitude of factors. So, bad cop, should we look at these findings at face value or with a little healthy dose of skepticism?
I think it's a great lens, Irina. A great lens to look at is always look at the vested interest. And by virtue of the name, the Flex Index, there's going to be an inherent bias towards flexible work arrangements. So yes, I would always look at the vested interest, but also I'm attuned to looking at a large cohort of data as well. So I'm trying to balance the two. So yes, let's always have that little devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. But when you look at this, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, let's have a look at just full-time in the office versus companies that require a few days in the office. So this is let's call it the rather extreme right wing of let's go back to the office, and then the relatively moderate couple of days back in the office. So amongst the companies that require at least some office attendance, those that come in a few days a week, right? They boasted sales twice the rate of the office full-time. So, there's a really interesting point there, is that when you break down just that cohort of either office or hybrid, the hybrid group fared better. So clearly what the data is showing is that the group that performed the worst was the fully in office. This kind of debunks, at least from a sales growth perspective, this debunks the greatest myth out there, which is the whole productivity story. Now, they could have looked at operating profit margins. They could have looked at free cash flow. They could have looked at shareholder returns. But Rob Sado, who's the CEO of the Flex Index, his direct quote was, "There's no perfect answer, but we felt that this was a step in the right direction." What I would say to that is that it is a very good first step. And I think we can expect a whole lot more from the Flex team as they build out this research over time. So in summary, this for me trumps all the chest beating that's out there about whether or not productivity has increased or not. But there's a whole lot more to come. But we have a very clear body of data that says a fully enabled, distributed, autonomous, location autonomous workforce has a far better chance of growing the sales in an organization than an office-bound or largely office-bound workforce.
Fair. Okay. I will take my bad cop thoughts, and I think it's a fair point. There was something else that really stood out for me. Because it's as you said yourself, it's a great report. Definitely recommend everyone have a look at it, because they're looking at not just company makeup, but also company size. And one thing when it comes to company size that really stood out for me is that when you look at the size of company and the way the company works, there is the inverse correlation. So the smaller the company, the more flexible they are. And when we talk flexible, like fully flexible versus structured hybrid. And structured hybrid is where there is a mandated time in the office. So under 500 people, 74% fully flexible, 14% structured hybrid. And then you go on the other end of the spectrum, 25,000 plus employees, fully flexible goes down to 14%. Structured hybrid, though, goes up to 60%. What do you make of this?
Frankly, I don't find this at all surprising. I mean, changing a large organization is like trying to turn a barge or a ship in the Panama Canal. It's a really, really hard thing to do. You know, so the cost of change and the friction that change brings in are a really enormous challenge and are transformational in nature for most companies. So, I really don't. It would be above my pay grade to criticize very large companies that have built a very strong business over the years, that their ability to change isn't as good as the small companies. That's sort of the comment from Dr. Obvious. So, companies, they need to assess their tolerance for driving change in the organization. So people like me, commentators, should not be throwing their oar in the water and having a splash. That's for companies to deal with themselves. What I would focus on is the difference between the large companies and the small companies. Smaller companies tend to have a very tight focus on costs, and real estate can be one of those crippling costs for a small early stage company. Now, the last 3 years taught us very clearly to think of a global rather than a local workforce, because you're able to tap into people who don't just live in the 30-kilometer or 50-kilometer commute area that you are. And a decision like this to have an office puts an automatic constraint on your access to talent. So do you want to attract talent from that 30K circle around where you've put an office? Or do you want to access talent from 1 or 2 time zones each side, which can be millions, and in some parts of the world, billions of people? And that's a decision that all startups need to take. And they can take it now because it's a proven model, and they've yet to invest in the real estate. Now, secondarily to that, Irina, I've not heard a single investor either encourage or mandate a leadership team to invest scarce capital in an office space. Not a single one. And I promise you, if I ever hear it in a meeting, I'll come back and share the thought and share the reason. Okay. The WFH research team, who we've talked about a lot, they've also done a lot of research on this, and they found that, and I'm going to let's call them the cohort of new companies. These are companies that have started in the last 12 years. And I think their data point was 2011. Yeah, so it would be 12 years. And they found that companies, let's call those the recent or new cohort companies, they are far more likely to be either fully remote or hybrid, with just a tiny percentage of them, of those being completely office-based. So the data would indicate that is a trend, that is a really old school trend, and the newer companies are eschewing that approach completely.
Fair point. One thing which I think is really interesting in this structured hybrid, I used to think that, hybrid is whether you choose to go to the office or not. It is a form of a hybrid. Like, you would have heard me refer to myself as someone that does hybrid. And then I think as we kind of redefine or get better at defining the terms, what I've actually realized is, like, I'm very much remote first, which means that I have, full flexibility to decide. And when I'm in Dublin, I tend to go to the office unless there is a storm baby there. And then when the storms get too much, I come to a place like Madeira, right? So that's remote first, fully flexible. But the definition about hybrid, it actually kind of requires that little form of structure in it. And by structure, it's like that mandated presence in the office. So yeah, what's really interesting is, actually, if you have a mandated presence in the office, do people actually follow this? If you have 3 days in the office, do actually people go there? So
Yeah.
a really interesting report that came out recently about the third quarter of the year from a company called Capella that specializes in hybrid work is how much are people actually following these policies in place. You have to be these days in the office and that number of days. And turns out that while in Q3 the policies really got their firmest, they're very clear policies, more companies are having these policies, the attendance in office actually dropped, and which basically means that there is a disparity between policy and adherence to the policy. What do you think about this, John?
I found this the report from Capella to be quite compelling, because what they're doing is they're looking at, let's call it the fractional office space. And again, they're looking at a significant amount of data and looking at the trends. So really, to use this this can be used as at least a good proxy to start off with as to whether or not mandates are working. So I'd encourage people to lean into this data. I think it's a quarterly report. Is that right? Correct? Quarterly report.
It's a quarterly report.
So again, this
yes.
is another one to get. I mean, and like most of these reports are, they're 5 to 10 minutes in reading, and they come out on a routine, either monthly or quarterly basis. And they're a really good source of data to reaffirm a position. So if anybody's out there looking to continue to share information within their organization, for you to take 10 minutes to read a report like this, to put 2 or 3 sound bites into a leadership team channel to reaffirm the decisions made, you're providing significant value. So I'd encourage you there. But this Capella report provides data that shows, as you said, that office attendance across the 25,000 people they track is actually decreasing, while, and as you said, the wildest thing here is it's decreasing while at the same time we have all of these, let's call them celebrity CEOs or high profile CEOs, continuing to talk about mandates. So if the attendance is decreasing as the rhetoric about the mandates are going up, that clearly says mandates aren't working. Okay, and we've seen this every year coming up towards Labor Day in the US, which is essentially the end of the summer, marks the end of the summer, where, it's all about return to work. And everybody's going to go back into the office, aren't you? Aren't you going to go back into? And it just hasn't happened. It didn't happen in 2020, 21, 22, 23. So we're 4 years in to this return to office mandate. And it is absolutely not a shred of data that shows that people are actually returning to the office. Quite to the contrary. So these guys, Capella, are showing that the compliance is down. You have folks like Nick Bloom predicting, as he said, that this Nike swoosh, that once we get to the stage of consolidating where we are right now, we're going to see this continued growth. So this brings challenges and problems. And to me, what this shows is the challenges and problems are compliance, adherence, and trust. And this, where this actually, and the report brings this out, it does impact employee retention, because, putting out a mandate like this will actually turn people off, and it may well turn your best people off, because there are a lot of other companies providing that level of flexibility. So that's an obvious one, retention. The second one is that it can undercut or completely destroy a company's DEI policy, diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, because by its very nature, it's anti, I'm not going to say exclusionary, but it's anti-inclusion. All of the cohorts that have benefited from advances in the DEI policies are essentially being attacked by these, not attacked, but their life is being made a lot more difficult through these policies. And there's another really fascinating point that they make in this research, is that this alone scuppers any and all efforts to track productivity. We all want to show within our organizations that productivity is either flat or increasing. But when you have this hodgepodge of mandates and lack of adherence and whatever, you have a mess. And it reminds me of a really funny expression that I heard recently called coffee badging, which I hadn't heard before. And it made me laugh initially, but really in a sad way. It showed in the avoidance techniques what behaviors you see when you have these asinine, silly mandate policies. So imagine commuting to the office, badging in, having a cup of coffee with a friend of yours in the office or whatever, and then immediately heading back out and commuting home to do your work, just so that you're recorded as having been in the office. And that's the kind of asinine behavior that policies like this drive. And I would always encourage people it's a really good thing in an organization to have a cheeky chap or somebody who's a complete jailbreaker or hacker or whatever, and watch their behavior when a policy like this comes out, and always be tuned into the people who are kind of nibbling away at the edges, because it will give you a sense as to the relative strength or the relative stupidity of a policy. And this coffee badging to me is a beaut. I love it.
Coffee badging. Okay, okay. I like it. I like it. Yeah, no, they were
Yeah.
making a really good point to the fact that um, when you have the people that are really sticklers for rules and they come in every day, they're meant to, and then there is the rebels that kind of don't, or I guess come for an hour for coffee. That creates a bit of a toxic environment as well, because it's like, well, why should I
Oh,
follow the rules and why does this person not follow the rules? And like, what is this double standard? People hate double standards.
yeah. Like the worst thing of all is this them and us, and policies like that, policies like what we just talked about, drive a them and us, which really is another way of saying it's these anti-inclusion or almost pro-exclusionary policies. So you got to be super careful about this.
Yeah, no, there you go. There you go. But yeah, Capella, great Irish American company, definitely worth
Yep.
following their reports. Now, moving on to more news territory. In the last couple of weeks, we
God,
heard that.
I wonder where you're going to go with this. I wonder where you're
Where
going
am
to
I
go
going
with
to
this.
go
Is
with
this the
this?
obvious
Well,
direction of go
what
on,
was the
go
big
for it? Hit me
news?
with the WeWork
Yeah,
stick.
yeah, what was the big news from a couple of weeks ago? Well, WeWork filing for bankruptcy, and it was once a bit of a golden child of the startup world, and there is a brilliant TV show devoted to it on Apple TV, which I would recommend anyone watch. But what do you make of this? Like, obviously, WeWork was always seen as this company that redefined the concept of an office, the concept of like where work is done, where remote workers could congregate and do their
Mhm.
work. And companies didn't have to invest in big offices, but rather it could take shared space and WeWork around the world. It didn't work out, or it's not working out great
Okay,
for
so
them for a
let's
variety of reasons. But
no.
what do you think here?
Well, first of all, I would encourage people, as you just mentioned, to look at We Crashed, which is a drama, a loosely based sort of docudrama on the crash of WeWork. Really insightful, very interesting, albeit a dramatized version of it. So it's not a documentary, but I found it to be compelling viewing. But let's pare back. WeWork was an outlandish play at talking up real estate as a tech play. Real estate isn't, it's bricks and mortar. It was never a tech play. And it has been massively exposed in the last couple of years. Like, I think Warren Buffett was the one who said, when the tide goes out, we see who doesn't wear any swimming trunks. And very clearly, WeWork was the poster child for that. But let me be really clear. The office is not dead. And the office as we know it is not dead. If you remember when VHS videotapes came out, you're too young, Irina, you wouldn't remember. I do. There was talk that the cinemas would die. There was talk that the movie business would shrink, and all this sort of doomsday stuff. Yes, there was change, but what actually changed was the manner in which we consumed the content. So we moved from small local cinemas to Cineplex type multi-screen locations, and ultimately to a world where you could get movies on subscription. If you remember, the first iteration of Netflix was DVDs that were mailed out. In fact, I think it was only in the last month that the last DVD was sent out by Netflix.
Yeah,
To
yeah,
now
yeah.
streaming, to now a situation where our the next two generations behind us, like This is a movie screen, and I've seen, and there are loads of people who watch movies on their phone. So it's changed completely. So what I'm saying is that what change is constant, inter mutanda constantia. Change is the one constant. So what we're seeing now in the marketplace is smaller, so we bring it back to from WeWork to what's actually happening in our work, let's call it our local spaces. We're seeing that the marketplace, it's more tuned to smaller, more local co-working locations. They're gaining a lot of traction. And other tweaks in what I would call the fractional office model, such as a company on the West Coast in the US, based in, I think, Seattle and also Milwaukee, which isn't in the Midwest, and San Francisco, called Radius.pro. They're gaining some interesting traction where it's almost like an Airbnb version where you rent out your home space where people can actually congregate and do some work. Really interesting to watch companies that are innovating like that. I wouldn't advocate for all of these companies directly, but I would say they're really, really worth watching. And I think this one is a very interesting play. And it's a space that you and I will keep an eye on over the next year or two, because I think we'll see significant evolution here. And this is where the interesting innovation will happen. So out of the ashes of WeWork, I think we're going to see some very interesting things growing. Look, I've always advocated that we're in an era of remote and office. So anybody who pitches this as a binary choice of remote or office, they risk polarizing people, akin to the political polarization that we see now in the US. The future is remote and office. And where on that continuum you want to be, you can be fully remote, and we all know the various continuum, but it is an and, not an or.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And I think, there is something to be said about it was a hard business model to, make work. And, obviously they bought a huge amount of real estate, it was growth for the sake of growth. Clearly, there's a lot of other co-working space companies, maybe not as big as WeWork, that are very much functioning and still existing. And feels like the small ones that have like good community management, they seem to be doing better. But also there is something to be said about maybe co-working is a bit more of a hobby business than this like really high growth 10x 20x kind of company that investors hope for.
It's not the solution to everything. Like, I'll give you an example of what I would typically use. And I was in a co-working space locally here in Cork this morning, the Republic of Work. What I use it for is the odd time to go and have a meeting. And it's almost like a place where I go to I use the term scratch the community itch, where I get a chance to sit in a room and meet with a couple of people and maybe spend an hour getting some non-deep time work done in the presence of other people. So you get the feeling of community. And then I was gone. And I was there from 8 to 10 in the morning, done and dusted. And it was almost like plugging in the car for a couple of hours and have enough juice now to keep me going for a couple of weeks. So I think that's the model. And to your point, it's not the be all and end all. And the big challenge with WeWork is it required a massive capital investment. And the one thing that we don't talk about, because it's way above our pay grade, is that the change in interest rates slaughtered them, absolutely slaughtered them. So as much as their hubris and distinct lack of humility, as much as that killed them, the turnaround in the interest rates destroyed them. But enough about WeWork. Completely. It's remote and office, not remote
and office. I love it. And look, as I said, I love my co-working space in Dublin, and I'm not gonna stop going there because it's the same as you. What was it? Coffee badging? Is that the term? Coffee?
Yeah, coffee badging. Yeah.
Coffee badging. So kind of coming to the end
Coffee badging,
of
yeah.
our chat, coffee badging, love it. A couple of things from The Economist that are really interesting. One is, and we've clearly talked about this today, more and more people are working from home. And I think the big question that was on people's minds over the last couple of years is, once the pandemic is kind of over, will that change? And clearly the answer is no. People are working more from home, they're spending more time from home,
Mm-hmm.
whether because they're doing fully remote or structured hybrid. So what The Economist is reporting is a shift toward what they call hermit economy and hermit behavior, and how that's changing the behavior of people. So less going out, less eating lunch in town, and more e-commerce, more purchasing goods for the home. And they estimate that this behavioral change will be around $600 billion in impact. What do you think about this, John?
So rather than addressing the question of the implications, I'm going to just take you through a couple of the sound bites from the article, because I think the article itself is probably the gold rather than my amateur commentary on the article. But essentially what the article is saying is that the post-pandemic consumers have actually reduced their spending on discretionary services, and they've increased their spending on things. So, 3 years on, the share of spending devoted to services remains below its pre-COVID levels relative to its pre-COVID trend. That decline is sharper still. Now, it's interesting when you look at let's call it the first world consumer or rich world consumer. As you said, they're spending about 600 billion a year less on services than you might have expected from 4 years ago. That's an enormous amount of money. But in particular, people are less interested, and this was surprising, they're less interested in leisure activities that take place outside the home, including hospitality and recreation. It's a little bit counterintuitive, because once we all were bunkered in 2020 and in 2021, there was all this talk about everybody wanted to get out, and there's an advance of people, there's increase in membership of this and that and the other. That trend actually hasn't manifested itself in a large body of data saying that there's a significant increase in the spend on activities. I think we can all see that there is an increase, or a perceived increase, in the number of people who are out walking and doing what I call low impact recreational or leisure activities. But that doesn't involve the spending of money. So this is purely on spend. So where's the money being redirected? So the money is actually being redirected to goods, ranging from durables, and I think the report talks about durables such as chairs and fridges, to clothes, food, and wine. So people are now looking at buying things rather than services. So it's a very interesting twist. So the next question is why? So if you look across, let's call it the first world or rich world people, all of the reports, and the Economist cited that people are now working 1 day a week at home. And listeners here would know that the oracle of the research here, Nick Bloom, Bloom, Barrero, and Davis, their work from home research data would indicate that it's between 1.5 and 2. So we're not going to argue about that. Let's just say it's 1 day a week at home. So that's a fairly significant change in work pattern, and this cuts the demand for services that historically would have been bought at the office, such as lunches and stuff, and it raises the demand for do-it-yourself goods, such as buying stuff in a grocery store, and oh my God, actually making your own lunch. Another interesting piece of data that they showed was last year in Italy. Italians spent 34% more on glassware, tableware, and household utensils than they did 4 years ago. So significant focus on more in-home dining, and less focus on buying, on purchasing outside of the home. So if you remember the craziness of 2020, and you had Boris Johnson imploring people to go back into the city of London to support the sandwich makers, which was the greatest BS and malarkey I've ever heard. But this is showing from a data perspective what people value now, and people are seeing the value that they got when they were at home and are seeing less value in, let's call it, the purchase of stuff in and around the office space. So the next kind of reason is values, and COVID may have made people genuinely more hermit-like. So again, and this, what I love about this is it's all data-based. So data-based. So, if you look at official data from the US, people slept 11 minutes more per day than in 2019. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but when you're talking about people averaging 6.5 hours of sleep, that's a fairly significant change in human behavior. 11 minutes on the basis of, kind of 300, close to 400 minutes. That's a fairly significant change. There's also, they're spending less on clubs that require memberships and other social activities, and more on things that are sort of solitary pursuits. So the values have changed, and by solitary pursuits, they reference things like gardening and pets. But another interesting one, actually, which shows it, is the card game Patience. And I love when people take quirky bits of data and share it. So the card game Patience, also in some places known as solitaire. So the global online searches for the word patience or solitaire are running twice as high now as they were in pre-pandemic level. So COVID's biggest legacy is, yes, that it caused people to step back and pull apart and be a little bit more hermit-like or hermetic. But we have to actually have a look to see what are the economic implications. And this report talks about some of those economic implications in black and white. So it's a very interesting report.
Yeah, no, indeed. And it's funny you mentioned Boris Johnson. I remember at the time Deutsche Bank suggesting that remote workers should be taxed more because they're spending less in the cities. So there was definitely some funny ones in there. And lastly, another entry from The Economist is a brilliant new podcast, Boss Class. It's run by Bartleby, who's been a columnist for Economist for years, and very hilarious look on the working world. What's interesting for me is the Boss Class is all about, how can leaders be better leaders, essentially, effective management. It's a 7-part series, and to me what's really interesting is that a whole episode of that is devoted to, where should people work from. So this is alongside, all topics like how to run better meetings, how to hire, how to, really enable teams. So it's really interesting for me that this is now on par with all of these huge management topics, which I think is a really interesting movement in the importance of where people work from as a topic.
Yeah, the report, the columnist you refer to, Bartleby, is one of the more ironic and tongue-in-cheek things in The Economist, and it affords The Economist to kind of take a view that is can be humorous, but in humor you get real truth as well. And so, like, even the name of it, the Boss Class, you can see the wink and the nod and kind of a little bit of a smirk and that. Now, I have to be honest, I haven't listened to the podcast yet. I have it lined up for my next car journey. But what I can attest to is the absolute need for managers to be comfortable putting their hands up and saying things like, I'm struggling with some aspects of managing a disparate workforce. Because if you think of it, you've had people who might have spent 30 years operating a business model that existed for 70 years before them, which was commute, going to the office, hierarchy, see people in person, I do this, and this. And then suddenly it is all changed. And not everybody has the skill set for that new world. And it's not too late to put your hand, it's never too late, but it's not too late to put your hand up and say, I am struggling with, I'm making up a topic here. I am struggling with going through a disciplinary with a member of staff, or doing talking about where a staff member needs to improve their performance. And if I have to do it online, I struggle because I much prefer doing it in person. Okay, that's a skill. If you don't develop that skill and don't work at it, not having that skill is going to hamper your development in this organization and maybe the next organization, and may well be the rock on which your career may founder if you don't deal with it now. So showing this vulnerability, in my book, is far better than trying to bash a square peg into a round hole and taking a big chunk of rock from 2019, trying to throw it on your shoulder and bring it forward into 2023 and land it on the desk. It just doesn't work like that. If you're not changing and if you're not evolving, you simply aren't providing, you're not future-proofing yourself as a leader if you're not doing that. So I'm going to listen to this and a few more of these of the episodes of Boss Class, because there seems to be a few gems in there. So I'm looking forward to that. But I would suspect, good, and it's a lot of it is tongue in cheek. But like I said, in humor lies some really funny and interesting observations where you kind of cringe. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. Like that episode in particular, it has Nick Bloom, it has Jamie Dimon, and everything in between. So, and it leaves you with like a really positive message, which I'm not going to give away, so people listen to it. But the podcast is brilliant. Like it starts with Bartleby going to on a Norway escapade kind of thing. It's like these MBA students that have 1 week they have to go through the fjords and camp and figure out how to be fast enough so they're not caught in the dark, and of course everything goes wrong, and so it's brilliant. Anyways, that's all for today. Thank you, John, for as always your candid thoughts, opinions. Next time we have an exciting thing lined up for episode 10, which will also be the last episode of 2023. We're doing a live episode, so me and John will be talking in a live forum with audience. So if anyone's interested in joining us, please do. You can ask your questions right on the spot. And what we'll be looking at is really a year in review. So we've talked about loads of articles, we've talked about loads of reports. Or let's actually, kind of take a bird's eye view. What's been the trends? What's been really going on? So we'll take some of our favorite topics, favorite contributors to these topics, and we'll chat through them. So hopefully people will be able to join us for that. December 5th at 4 p.m. Irish time. Thank you, John, and I'll see you in December.
Take care. See you, Irina.
Bye.